what are the toxins in and out of sight that we're exposed to on a daily basis? Because literally many of them are hiding in plain sight. And one of the reasons for this is that, geez, about 50 plus years ago, 1958, when Congress adapted this sort of generally regarded as safe clause with respect to the Food and Drug Administration, and with new chemicals that were being petitioned to get into not only into foods, but into regular everyday use. For example, whether it be for a pesticide, herbicide, or whatnot, they had this kind of loophole, if you will, called the generally regarded as safe chemical loophole, or GRAS, as I've often referred to it, GRAS, generally regarded as safe. And this was way back when Congress enacted that in 1958. And sadly, this is still the mechanism by which many new chemicals that are added to our food are basically streamlined, fast-tracked, if you will, getting into the food without actually doing an individual sort of chemical solicitation for each and every new ingredient. In fact, since the year 2000, so the last 20 years or so, 99% of all new food chemicals that have been introduced into our food supply have used this loophole, this generally regarded as safe loophole, or GRAS, to get into our food supply without formally having done petitions to get into the food supply. And so just to get a little bit of a take on the numbers, 756 out of 766, so well over 90+% of these, nearly 99% of these new food chemicals that have been added to this food supply just since the year 2000, 98% of them, 98.7 in fact, have used this loophole, or the generally regarded as safe, or GRAS loophole, that lets them just fast track into the food supply, sort of bypassing, any formal FDA petition because of this 1958 loophole that still exists, and they're getting into our food supply. It is not a good thing. In fact, right now, present day, just to give you a little bit of a scope on what this looks like, there's more than 86,000 chemicals in use in the US that have basically been categorized and that are on sort of the radar of the EPA, right? The Environmental Protection Agency. And of those 86 some odd thousand, 40,000 are used very regularly, kind of like daily stuff in commerce, 40,000 chemicals. And what's sad about this is that many of them, we just have no idea. They fly under the radar. You may see on the label something like fragrance, and it could be any number of things. In fact, for that reason, I'll talk about this a little bit later, I don't use anything that has any kind of quote unquote fragrance, because it's just too many things can sneak in under that description, and most of which are not awesome, because toxins are exactly that. They are toxic. In fact, toxins can be either man-made, which many of these substances are that I'm speaking of, these 86,000 some odd of them that are used here in the US, but they're either man-made or they could be naturally occurring, of course, like things like the heavy metals, right? We have lead, we have mercury. These are naturally occurring elements, but they're not for human consumption, right? We're not supposed to be eating these things. And so toxins can be man-made or naturally occurring, and they cause harm to organisms. So what's interesting is that we always have this sort of question that comes up, well, what's a safe level? Well, to be honest, toxins are not safe. Yes, theoretically, it's the dose that makes the poison, and our human body is fantastically resilient to so many things, but there's really no quote unquote safe level for many of these things. In fact, when I was in medical school, for example, we had a quote unquote safe level for lead, and that was 5 milligrams per deciliter was considered safe or normal. And now, of course, we've dropped that in recent years to 3.5, and even normal quote unquote levels of 2 to 3 milligrams per deciliter are actually shown to cause significant deleterious effects, especially on brain development, right? In kids, this is traumatic. Their brains are developing rapidly if they're exposed to lead in their toys or in paint or in silverware or the ceramics and things that we have in the house that we're serving food out of, or whatever that is, or just in the ground, in the dirt, right? Because lead is basically forever there. It's not going to go away. But if the kids are exposed to it, even at so-called safe levels between 2 and 3 milligrams per deciliter, this has been shown to have significant cognitive effects and deficits leading to decreased IQ, decreased development of their neurological system, right? Their brains. This is not awesome. And so I want to take a look today at some of the most common toxins out there that we get exposed to, and that we get exposed to regularly. And one thing at the outset I want you to appreciate is that it's not just a simple math equation. You're exposed to toxin A, maybe toxin B, and maybe C, D, E, F, G. I mean, there's literally thousands of these things that we may be exposed to, but the result is not as simple as it may seem. So in other words, it's not just a cumulative result. It's not just 1 + 1 = 2, right? Many of these together can have, sadly, a synergistic effect where 1 + 1 might be 4, or it might be 10, depending on how these toxins interact with one another. And within the body, they can have a significantly deleterious effect. And so at the outset, I want to provide you with some hope because I'm just a hopeful, optimistic guy. And I know that although we're exposed to a lot of these things, many of which are outside our control, but the good news is many of them are within our control. And there's some simple daily practices that we can invoke, that we can take advantage of, that will help us tremendously. And so I want to get started with that here in just a moment. And I just want you to realize that it's not just us, right? It's not just us as adults that are familiar, that can actually look at food labels, that can look at the things we're exposed to, but this affects all of humanity, right? Especially babies. And what just blew my mind is even babies in development, right? In utero, while they were still in the womb of their mother, they haven't even been born yet. They're being exposed to hundreds and hundreds of toxins. In fact, there was a recent study that was shown looking at exactly this, where they examined, on average, they were looking at babies, and they found on average over 200 toxins in the blood of newborn babies. And they included things like pesticides, heavy metals, flame retardants, PFCs, or fluorinated chemicals and other toxins, over 200 in the blood of newborns. Like, what is going on? They can't even, directly be exposed. This is through their exposure from the mother. So, and this is not to scare you. This is not to, to scare any mothers out there who want to get pregnant. No, absolutely not. This is just so that we realize that this is a big deal. This is a pervasive, big problem. And in fact, fortunately, there are many things that we can do, right? Things that we can do that are simple. In fact, let's just start with simple stuff like right now, present day. Let's just grab a food label. And if you look at it, number one, you have to look at that silly list on the back, not just the label that says organic or whatever it says on there. In many cases, my pet peeve is when the salad dressings say extra virgin olive oil or olive oil salad dressing. And then you flip it over and look at that silly ingredients list, and olive oil is like number 5, 7, 10th ingredient after things like soybean oil or sunflower, safflower, canola oil. And even though those may be quote unquote organic, that doesn't tell all, right? We know all the seed oils, the industrial oils, are highly inflammatory. They're not good for us. And so you got to read the label. So rule number one is you just simply read the label. And even better than rule number one, if we mostly eat, say 90% of what we eat are single ingredient whole foods that don't even need a label, right? The plants, the vegetables, the amazing luscious fruits that are out there, the well-sourced proteins, whether it be grass-fed and finished beef, for example, wild-caught fish, what have you, or pasture raised, and just, the food sources that are out there that are single ingredients that were raised appropriately with their species specific diet, right? If they're, for example, if we're eating some kind of beef, that it was allowed to feed on the grasses of the field, right? That's what they're supposed to eat. In fact, it's so interesting. There's been some studies, especially out of Europe, where they have these amazing free range herds that are feeding off all sorts of herbal grasses and all these different amazing plants that we actually benefit from that. And when we eat that well-sourced beef, we actually get some of the benefits of those plants that they ate. So we are not only what we eat, but what we eat has eaten, right? It's super important. You got to go down, look at the sourcing, but it's so cool. So rule number one, just read the ingredients. And if you can, of course, put the overwhelming majority of your food into that single ingredient category where you know what it is, and if you can get it well sourced, be it local or you've grown it yourself in your garden, or you know the local farmers, what have you, or it's organic, pesticide free, non-GMO, all of this stuff is always going to be better. But when you do look at the label, look at those ingredients and see if you recognize them all. If you do recognize them and you know the role of everything in there and none of them look like they should belong in a chemistry lab, then maybe that's a decent a food item. For me, I kind of use this arbitrary 5-ingredient rule. I don't like to eat things that have more than 5 ingredients. And occasionally I'll have something that might have a few more, maybe 6 or 7, but I have to recognize what each and every one of those ingredients are, right? I want to know what's in my food. And in years past, right, we know a lot of things have been snuck in there, snuck in there under the radar. And many of them are preservatives. There's been all kinds of just crazy chemicals. For example, the chemical that was in the Subway sandwich bread, right, for many years until they finally got it removed. That was the same chemical that was found in yoga mats, for example, the azodicarbamide, for example, or even BHT, the butylated hydroxytoluene, that's been used in certain breads and foods as a preservative. Like these kinds of things, if we look at a label and we don't recognize what's in it, and it sounds like it should be in a chemistry lab, like just put it back. The next little test is, as we look at that ingredients list, just ask ourselves, is it, or are these ingredients nutritious, right? Is it actually something that's good for us? Just because we recognize it, maybe it's like 5 different types of sugar, right? Cane sugar, rice, brown rice syrup, or whatever it is. We recognize what it is, but is it actually good for us? Because I would venture to say that although, sugar in and of itself is not quote unquote a toxin, it's not, doesn't meet that category, but I would say actually too much sugar is certainly toxic, right? When I share with people my sort of basic 3 things to avoid in food, it is purposefully extremely simple. So simple that I just say, look, avoid the highly processed, you've guessed it, number 1, sugars. Avoid the highly processed sugars under whatever name that they have, whether it be brown rice syrup, or I don't care what name they put in there, cane sugar, all these different things. We shouldn't be eating a lot of sugar, especially highly processed sugar. Number 2, the highly processed grains and flours. And gluten is just the tip of the iceberg. Like, I pretty much avoid anything wheat or gluten containing potentially because it's just not the same wheat that we have used traditionally, right? Right now, or actually just recently, my wife and son and my wife's mother have been in Europe, and they've been eating homemade pastas and homemade breads and things, and they're feeling fantastic because they don't use the dwarf wheat that we use here. And then they're going to come home here to the US and they're not going to be able to touch any of these things for a long time, right? We basically don't really buy bread or most pasta products because they just don't contain the original sort of wheat that we've used for millennia. They have this highly hybridized GMO or dwarf wheat that not only is heavily sprayed with things like glyphosate and other toxic herbicides, pesticides, but also it just doesn't have the nutrition content that we've been used to. And it has offending agents like gluten and high numbers of this gliadin protein, it's called, that actually is super inflammatory. And it can cause any number of not awesome conditions, from the basics that you guys have all heard about, right? The gluten sensitivities, you've heard of that, the Whipple's disease and things like that, celiac, for example, as well as even type 1 diabetes, like that which my daughter has, could have been partially triggered by gluten. In fact, I'm convinced that it, among other things in her diet and exposures in her history, were likely contributing to why she got autoimmune disease. Did you know that much autoimmune disease, I would say a majority of it out there, and this is in sort of the infancy stages of being studied, although there's actually quite a bit of data out there looking at things like the rheumatologic disease, whether it be rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, Sjogren, systemic sclerosis, even thyroid disease like Graves and Hashimoto's super common, thyroiditis. Many people have these autoimmune conditions, and much of it is actually related not only to diet, but specifically to the toxins that we are exposed to. And so that's why I'm so passionate about this, not just because I feel like part of what my daughter was exposed to that caused her to get type 1 diabetes was in her food supply and in her environment, but there's so many things that can affect us that literally are flying under the radar. Like I mentioned at the outset, this generally regarded as safe loophole that many food manufacturers have used for decades. In fact, in the last 20 years, 97.8% of these new food chemicals that are in our food supply got in there through this loophole. They weren't even well studied and actually tested for safety. And we've got this, sad to say, yes, being an American here in the US, we've got this completely wrong. In Europe, for example, my wife has been visiting lately, they have it differently. They actually have to prove that it's safe before they can put it in the food supply. In the US, it's sort of like grandfathered in, oh, it's generally safe, we don't even have to test it. Like BS, right? You guys have all heard about mac and cheese, Kraft mac and cheese. For decades in Europe, they haven't used, the yellow artificial dyes, for example. And I think we finally cut that out now, but in Europe, they didn't use that, right? They used turmeric, right? For the coloring, the beta carotene and whatnot. They didn't use the artificial dyes because they couldn't get away with it in Europe. Here in the US, they could get away with it. So without belaboring that, I'm just going to talk about a couple of the common toxins that we can be exposed to. And the reasoning for this, one, is that most of these toxins are just persistent. They literally are, you've heard this term, forever chemicals. They get into the food supply, the environment, and they just don't go away. They don't decay to any reasonable degree. In fact, let's just take, for example, I'm a little bit passionate about mercury and the heavy metals because I personally had some issue with this. I was eating way too much tuna. I actually was eating lots of tuna fish. I grew up eating tuna fish because it was highly protein based, and we just thought that was the most nutritious thing ever. And me and other people, like you've heard of Tony Robbins, he had a big scare really with mercury poisoning from eating lots of tuna. I didn't get to that extreme where I was requiring blood transfusions and other things and a hardcore chelation like he got, but I've had to deal with that. And what's the interesting thing with respect to many of these toxins, not just mercury, is their half-life, that it's very prolonged. Most of these heavy metals like mercury, cadmium, lead, their half-life is around 30 years, which means that, let's say, you're exposed to a certain amount, and basically between now and 30 years from now, you would still have half of that in your body. In 30 years, you would still have half of it. So the half-life is so long, it's it's crazy. And so that's why procedures like chelation come into play. And that's something we'll think about. And we'll talk about a little bit later in the show today. But that issue, this persistence in the environment, whether it be the forever chemicals that you've heard talked about, for example, the endocrine disrupting chemicals that literally have been called this. They've been called forever chemicals because they stay in the air, in the water, in the soil, and they just the cyclical nature. They're all around us. And so there are a few things we can do. I'm going to get to that in just a second. Don't worry. But besides the issue of being forever chemicals, this significant half-life or persistence, excuse me, a lot of people have decreased clearance. In other words, their body's ability to degrade and get rid of these chemicals is diminished. And we'll talk about that as well, because there's certain things that can help you. We've, of course, heard of this glutathione pathway, which is probably the most famous of all the antioxidants. It's so important, right? In the liver, we have this huge machinery that helps detoxify the things we're exposed to, the cytochrome P450 system. And I'm not going to get into that too much because that's maybe a little bit too much into the weeds. I love to talk about it because the biochemistry actually had a minor in that. And it's just fascinating to talk about the cytochrome P450 system in the liver. But what I will sort of summarize with is the need for us to make sure we're consuming a diet rich in antioxidants that will support this system in the liver, the cytochrome P450 system. For example, glutathione, right? We need to support that. That's one of the most important antioxidants that we know of. And also many of the others that are largely found in the fresh fruits and vegetables and in organ meats, which I know many of us don't eat, but we could be, right? We could be. And if you can't tolerate them, eat them, then there are also freeze-dried capsules available as well. But let me just talk one more moment about mercury, because it's kind of been a friend or foe of mine, because I love tuna. I love ahi. That's the fresh tuna. It can be found in these fish even when they're wild caught, because it gets into the environment, it gets into the water source. It's from things like Dental fillings. A lot of us have had dental fillings as kids. The amalgams, where they kind of put a hodgepodge of different metals. If you open your mouth, like I'm doing here, I was fortunate. My dad's a dentist and he kind of knew about this. And so he didn't do any of the amalgam fillings in my mouth. I got the ceramic type of fillings. And so not only do, as I'm showing the folks on YouTube, I don't have any of those dark metallic rings or anything in my teeth, but I fortunately wasn't exposed to this. And for those that may have mercury in their fillings, this was a very, very common practice. In fact, sadly, it's still practiced today. Some dentists are still using these amalgam fillings that do have mercury there. And so if you have that and you have elevated mercury, you might consider having them removed and having supervision, because you'll want to have some chelation as they're removing them, so you don't have a big spike in your exposure and things like that. But I've definitely heard of many cases of folks that have had significant issues with heavy metals like lead and mercury in fillings. And when they had those fillings removed, this has been a tremendous benefit. But another common source besides, my favorite, right, the ahi or the big fish, especially swordfish, basically the top bigger fish in the food chain tend to have more of the mercury because of what they call bioaccumulation, which is basically that they are eating the smaller fish. And as they eat more and more, it coalesces in their bodies, right? Most of these toxins are stored in fat. And so that's also another issue. If you like really fatty fish, I would suggest when you cook it, kind of trim off as much of the fat as possible, because that's where the toxins are going to be preferentially stored, is in the fat. They can also be in the environment from just simply being in the air, right? A lot of the plants out there that are giving us the modern convenience of electricity are burning coal. And you can get some mercury into the air from the coal plants, which accounts for, about 44% of all man-made mercury emissions is through those coal-fired plants. And what does it do? It gets in the air, then it falls to the ground, it gets into the soil, it gets into our water source. So something to be aware of. And if you live close to a coal-burning plant, I don't envy you. You might want to take some precautions there with the way that your air is filtered in your home. You want to have some pretty high quality HEPA filter systems and things like that. You want to make sure you're filtering your water, reverse osmosis, maybe adding a charcoal filter after that as well, trying to reduce as much of these potential toxins from your water source, because mercury is not awesome. It just tweaks with your immune system. It gets into the immune cells. It kind of makes these kind of funky, bastardized, even chimeric immune cells that can be viewed as foreign. And they can attack your own cells, but they can help produce antibodies that then attack your cells, and it can lead to significant autoimmune disease. And so it's actually been shown to be associated elevated mercury levels with autoimmune disease, such as MS, which is multiple sclerosis, for example. As well as, interestingly, what is a newer thing is that they have shown that also it can be related to other autoimmune conditions, beyond the rheumatoid arthritis and the lupus, but also in the thyroid. It can go into the thyroid gland and accumulate. Mercury can actually go there. And folks have been shown to have increased risk of thyroid disease, especially in young women. And this has been demonstrated through the increase in the anti-thyroglobulin antibodies. And so mercury is a big deal. Be careful. Don't eat a bunch of tuna fish out of the can like I did for years. And if you do love fish like I do, maybe consider eating a lot of these really smaller fish, like the sardines, for example. Wild-caught salmon tends to be okay, at least better than the big giant tuna slabs that I've gotten accustomed to eating over the years. And I actually eat a lot less now that I'm more aware of this. And when I'm not in Hawaii, essentially, I don't really eat any fish. And so lately, that's been a lot of the time. I've been in Utah, as many of you know, visiting my family. My mother and stepmother are here. I've been traveling a lot. I've been in Florida a lot as well, both for work and other reasons there. And so I've been away from Hawaii a lot. And so I don't eat nearly as much fish as I used to. And so that's kind of a good thing with respect to decreasing my mercury exposure. But fish does have a lot of good benefits, right? We know the omega-3 fatty acid, which is amazing. I've been actually buying from Costco these sardines that they're fishy, if you will, but they're packed in extra virgin olive oil, and they have way less, if any, significant mercury contamination. So sardines and the small fish are safer. Another heavy metal that we were exposed to, I'll just mention this briefly, is lead, right? It used to be in the gasoline. Leaded gasoline was kind of the thing, and that hasn't been a thing for 50 years. But also, what's interesting is I hadn't realized this, still most of the airplanes here in this country are still burning leaded fuel. They do have leaded aviation fuel in over 100,000 planes. So if you live downwind of an airport, this may be a significant exposure to you because it obviously gets into the air. And so it's still a thing. You know, we used to just say the old homes that had this lead paint and kids eating paint chips. Well, that's just kind of tip of the iceberg. It gets into the soil, it gets into the air. And like I said, if you live downstream of an airport, that could be an issue. What's I think something that we don't realize is that there are certain plants out there that absorb this at a very high rate. And it's not simply something that you can just wash off the plant. It's not like maybe they sprayed it with something and you just wash it off really good and you don't have to worry about it. It actually gets into the plant and it can't be removed by washing or even food processing. Some of the plants that absorb this at higher frequencies, and I hesitate to even say this because it's some of the things that I love. It's like chocolate, for example. Dark chocolate. So one of my favorite go-tos for antioxidants, and I'm not talking about eating a whole bar. I'll eat like 1 or 2 little squares a day, but certain chocolates will have a higher propensity to having contamination with lead. So you got to be familiar. I use the EWG.org website, Environmental Working Group. It's actually an amazing website in and of itself. But they actually look at the different manufacturers. They look at any potential toxins. They have an amazing site that they update every year, the Clean 15 and the Dirty Dozen. And they look at both fruits and vegetables, as well as other more processed foods. You can look them up in their database. Once again, that's EWG.org or the Environmental Working Group. And I have the app on my phone. And if you haven't gotten it, it's free. Support them. I think they're an amazing cause and really a great resource. What's bad about lead is not only does it tweak with all your hormones, it affects the hypothalamic pituitary axis, but it also, of course, decreases that key antioxidant in our body called glutathione. Lead just really messes with that. And as I mentioned at the outset, it's problematic at really any level. There's really no safe level, if you will, of lead. And so it just kind of bothers me that on lab tests, we used to say for many years, up to levels of 5 are safe. And now, like I mentioned at the outset, they've lowered that to, I think, 3.5 in 2021. But really no level is safe. It can lead to, of course, in kids, the learning disabilities, the decreased IQ, behavioral problems. It can accumulate over the years. And even though it says on a blood test sort of this low-ish level, maybe somewhere between 2 and 5, it accumulates and it stays with us. Remember that half-life of 30 years? It's primarily because a lot of this just sits in the bone and it's not being sort of recirculated or removed, excreted. And the other sources besides the paint chips, besides in the air, if you live downstream of an airport or for some reason they're burning coal and things close by, but it also can be in cookware. And this is something that I've really paid more attention to of late. When I first started having kids, I just bought whatever was the least expensive and the easiest, right? Like I was probably buying Teflon everything because, the food kind of slips right off. It's easier to clean. Like how amazing this is now. That stuff like freaks me out because most of the cookware out there that has any kind of a glaze over it has the potential to be contaminated with lead. In fact, my favorite, which over the years I've used a lot and I've kind of repented, I don't use it much anymore, is the crock pot, because that glazed covering in a crock pot actually has been shown in certain cases to emit lead. And that lead has a 30-year half-life. In fact, there was an interesting study out of Utah, and I can only guess why it was done out of Utah, because I think so many people use the crock pot in Utah, but it said 20% of the slow cookers were releasing measurable amounts of lead into the food. Measurable amounts in 20%. So fortunately, it wasn't 90 or 100%, but it gave me pause. And so one of the least likely similar type food equipment is the new Instapot, which actually we have and we use way more now than we do our crock pot because the time, right? It's fast. You can, what I love to do in there, I know it sounds crazy. I throw a bunch of chicken in there, dump a whole thing of salsa, and I just do the Instapot for 20 to 30 minutes in high speed, whatever, and it softens up that chicken, it cooks it. I shred it and I can throw it in so many different things, whether it be a taco, a fajita, an enchilada, a soup, whatever it is. And it's amazing. So I love the Instapot. But the number one reason, besides the fact that it saves you a lot of time, is that it doesn't have that glazed coating. It's a stainless, at least the one I have, it's a stainless steel coating. And so that's much safer than using a glazed coating like in a crock pot, for example. Another heavy metal that I'll just say briefly, and I've shared with it on my Instagram and in podcasts before, is arsenic. And arsenic is often in the soil. Certain plants pick it up at a high rate. And that's why I've stopped eating brown rice. I used to be only brown rice because I was told it was more healthy, right? It has more fiber, whatever, but it can tend to have higher contamination with arsenic. So I don't eat any brown rice anymore. In fact, I hardly eat any rice at all. But if I do, it's generally white rice and it's a small amount. It's maybe a half or a quarter of a scoop, as opposed to all my blessed Hawaiian colleagues, that's 2 scoop rice with everything. And that's kind of what I did for 20 years because that's just how they serve the food. 2 scoop rice comes with everything. But I don't eat much rice, not just because of the arsenic, but because I just don't need those sort of empty carbs. If I do eat it, what's common, and I've shared with this before, is I'll cook a big pot of rice, and then I cool it in the fridge, and then I'll have it over the course of a week, a little bit at a time. And then when you cool it and then reheat it, it has that carbohydrate load in there, gets converted into a resistant starch, which has less of a blood sugar, less of an insulin spike. It actually can feed the bacteria in your gut. It becomes one of these resistant starches that increases the flora of the type that you want, the so-called good microbiota in your gut. And so when I do eat rice, it tends to be reheated because I'll cook it once for a whole week. And then for the whole rest of the week, I'll just pull it out of the fridge, out of my glass Tupperware. I don't use plastic Tupperware really anymore because, of course, the plastic issue, we'll talk about that in just a minute, the microplastics, the tip of the iceberg, is the plastics that we've all been told about to avoid, right? And we'll talk about the A's and the B's and the S's, that are out there because they're all not good for us. Because it used to be just said, well, BPA, right? Avoid BPA. And then everybody said, okay, it's BPA free. What they didn't tell us is that they changed it to BPS, which is probably as dangerous and who knows, may even be more dangerous than BPA. So just because it says BPA free doesn't mean it's BPS free or one of the others. And so I have leaned towards mostly using glass. And that's glass pretty much in everything, drinking out of glass, drinking, my water bottles that I use are glass or aluminum or something like that. That's not going to emit anything, that I can wash it in the dishwasher on the high heat and all that, not cause an issue. So we don't use a lot of plastic anymore. And I would recommend trying to avoid plastic whenever possible. As far as the arsenic, what I found interesting is not only, of course, does it increase the stress, the so-called oxidative stress, the free radical damage that can occur, but in children and adolescents who develop type 1 diabetes, this was interesting. I didn't know this. It was shown that many of them had higher levels of arsenic. In a Swedish study, in fact, children who developed type 1 diabetes were found to have higher levels of arsenic, mercury, and aluminum starting at birth. And so this has given me much cause to just kind of like take a moment, think, consider, how could we avoid these levels of arsenic, mercury, and aluminum, exposures in kids. This has been shown to increase the risk of type 1 diabetes. Of course, now it's all retrospective. In my case, for example, my daughter has type 1 diabetes, but I think about, certainly we were using lots of plastics. We were using different cookware. We were not as attuned to this tuna issue. And I'm sure we had significant mercury. We always ate a lot of fish. In fact, we would go to Costco and buy is it like a 10 stack or something, or a dozen of these cans of tuna, in a big reel or ream or whatever you want to call it. We would buy these things commonly and we would eat tuna all the time. And I just think about that and think, gosh, is it possible that this might have contributed to my daughter's diabetes? I mean, it's too late now, if you will, but I have other kids that don't have diabetes that I pray won't get type 1 diabetes, but it certainly gives me pause. And we're definitely being more careful. Cadmium is another heavy metal that has this it's not a forever chemical in the body, but it's about a 30-year half-life as well. And it's been found in higher levels in certain plants like chocolate, for example. And it's one of the highest sources of cadmium as well as lead. And so I still think that having high quality dark chocolate is important. I still eat some, but I'm definitely more specific about which ones I eat. If you have further questions about this, feel free to message me over on Instagram, Dr. Thomas Hemingway, Dr. Thomas Hemingway, or reach out to me on email, because I don't have time to go through an exhaustive list right now, but also one of the resources I use on the daily, like I said, I have the app, ewg.org is a great source to go to. Triclosan, many of you have heard of this because it used to be in a lot of soap. In my background in the hospital setting, we had this crap in like basically all the hospital soap for years. Since 2017, thankfully, it's been banned, but it's one of these forever chemicals. It doesn't really go away. It's been in toothpaste. It is all over the place. So it gets in the lakes, it gets in the rivers, and it's bad. It's one of these forever chemicals. Fortunately, they finally banned it, but it's been shown to increase incidence of autoimmune disease like lupus and the arthritis, for example. I'm gonna move on in the interest of time here to discuss one of the most pervasive chemicals out there, which are the so-called EDCs, the endocrine disrupting chemicals. And I alluded to this a little bit when I talked about BPA and BPS, if you will, because these are the most common ones many of you have heard about that damage the endocrine system, and they can act as sort of estrogen analogs. They can hit that estrogen receptor, and they can contribute to causes such as insulin resistance, even obesity, even PCOS, for example. In fact, scientists estimated that healthcare costs alone just from these EDCs, or the endocrine disrupting chemicals, can be a staggering 175 billion per year in Europe alone. And so they're already regulating these EDCs, these endocrine disrupting chemicals. And sadly, here in the US, we are not so much. We really are not. And they've also been looked at in the causing of type 1 diabetes. And as I mentioned with my daughter, we always used plastic back in those days. I mean, that's just what everybody did, right? I mean, from the baby bottles to really everything was in plastic. And of course, that has BPA and PFCs and PCBs and phthalates and flame retardant, all these kinds of things that are not awesome. And one of the easiest way to avoid most of them is just read the labels and be careful. And this is one thing I hadn't thought of a lot about until the last couple of years, is just the things that are around our homes, right? Whether it be the furniture we purchase, the bed linens that we purchase. This is kind of a new one that I'm paying more attention to, because many of these have these chemicals in them as either a waterproofing agent, like in the sofa or the carpet, for example. That's why, if you've ever been to my home, most of our place, everywhere, where we have a place that we stay in the world, we generally have tile. We love tile because we can clean it. It's not going to emit all these crazy, Teflon or Gore-Tex or other sort of chemicals that make, waterproofing amazing. It makes the stains easy to remove and whatnot, but they're off-gassing all the time. And unless you're keeping your windows open 24/7 and getting this crap out of there, I still don't think it's awesome. In fact, I'm paying a lot more attention to what's in my home nowadays, and I'm using the HEPA filtration with my air purifiers and things like that. But the common places that we find the PCBs, which are the polychlorinated biphenyls, are in flame retardants. And they've been shown to cause increases in autoimmune disease, like thyroid disease, for example, thyroiditis, HASHIMOTOS. They've also been shown to increase type 1 diabetes. And sadly, they not only are in those flame retardants, but they can get into the water. And they are commonly found in, here it is, guys, here it is, in fish that is not wild caught. The factory or farm raised salmon tend to be high in this PCB contamination. And it's even been found in their feed. And it accumulates. And it's also been found in dairy, beef, and chicken in the non-organic one. So I'm trying my best to typically buy organic. As I've mentioned before, if I buy milk, it's the A2 milk. It's the organic A2 milk. I personally don't drink it. Some of my kids still like to have milk on occasion, make a smoothie or whatever. And so I'm looking for organic precisely for this reason, so it doesn't have the PCBs in there. And pesticides is a huge thing. I could do an entire podcast on pesticides, especially the common one we all know about, the glyphosate or the Roundup, that is literally 13 billion pounds of it per year is being used still, even though we know that it's not awesome. And it's been even classified by the WHO as to be carcinogenic to humans, right? I mean, in over 1,000 different studies, they've looked at this and they've been concerned about it, yet somehow it's grass, right? Generally regarded as safe. So that's why I think it is so imperative that we look hard and try to get our food, if at all possible, organic and non-GMO, because most of the GMO crops, like the soy, like the corn, right, like the wheat, they specifically get a gene in there, right? They've genetically modified the plant so that it has a gene in there that's resistant to the glyphosate or the Roundup, so they can spray the heck out of it. They spray this stuff insanely, and we're not resistant to it. We as humans are not resistant to it. It has significant effects, and especially on our microbiota, on our gut health. This is like an antibiotic just stormed to the gut, killing all kinds of bacteria. It is not awesome. It may even play a huge role in the pathogenesis of celiac, which is, of course, that sensitivity to gluten. And, it's always been debated, right? Of course, the Monsanto et al. Folks are saying it's safe because it benefits them, right? But the soy, the corn, the wheat, anything that's GMO modified to have these genes is generally getting sprayed like crazy. And so I try to avoid GMO foods for that reason. I'm just concerned about the pesticide use. And so if you can find those that are labeled organic, USDA organic, or non-GMO project verified, I would look for that. And just backing up to finish off the BPA piece, as mentioned, these plastics are endocrine disrupting chemicals. And there's been at least 11 different mechanisms in the literature that have been shown to elucidate or share how this BPA and other endocrine disrupting chemicals can cause autoimmune disease, like the type 1 diabetes that my daughter has, or like lupus, or like rheumatologic disease, like arthritis, or Sjogren's, or ankylosing spondylitis, or thyroiditis, Hashimoto's, for example. And BPA is the one that's getting the bad press, right? And the reason it causes the damage is it causes significant oxidative stress. And that's a common mechanism. And it's also been shown to increase cardiovascular disease, increase type 2 diabetes as well. Multiple harmful effects. And the source that we usually blame is sort of the plastics in water bottles and lining of cans, for example. The sad thing is that many of these BPA linings have been replaced with BPS. And they're not really saying that on the label. They just say BPA free. And so I just do my darndest to avoid anything plastic if I can. Even that silly grocery store thermal paper, right? Like, I feel bad for the folks that work there that are touching it. I really feel like they should be wearing gloves to give them some barrier from touching these receipts all day long, because they have a significant amount of BPA. And they've actually been shown, they've looked at cashiers. There was an interesting study done. I think I can find it real quick to show you. But it looked at the levels of BPA in folks that work as cashiers. And they found it to be disproportionately elevated compared to controls. Dermal exposure by Yan Shan. The article was entitled Dermal Exposure. And it looked at exactly that. And it just bums me out that many of them have no idea. I mean, they hand me the receipt and I just usually say, no, thank you, or put it in a bag, or I try not to touch it myself. But I think those folks that work there that have this high risk, they're touching these receipts all day, every day. And it's crazy. Anyway, to sum this up, we're getting to the end of the podcast here. We're running out of time. We're at 40 some odd minutes. But I wanted to share with you some of the things that we can easily do on a daily basis. And I'm going to start with water. Why? Because as I mentioned, many of these toxins get into our soil, get into our groundwater, and we don't even know about it. The PFAs, we think about it, the PCBs and the BPAs, because, we're kind of on high alert. It's on our radar, if you will. We're trying to avoid plastic water bottles. I mean, I'll be honest, if I'm on an airplane and that's the only thing that's offered to me is plastic water bottle, I'll take it, but I'm not buying. I used to buy cases of these things. I don't buy them anymore because I don't know if they've been sitting out in the sun and they're full of, if they say BPA free, maybe it's BPS, or maybe it's just the microplastics from getting exposed to ultraviolet light. Maybe they sat in the sun for an hour or two, or 20 or 1,000, or who knows, right? So I try to avoid, drinking out of plastic, but also avoiding tap water in most cases that I haven't filtered. And I don't get any kickback from the Berkey folks, but I have one of these giant Berkey filters on my countertop. It's this huge, I think it's about a 5-gallon thing that we're drinking out of, even though we have admittedly pretty good water quality. When we're up in the mountains, we have basically the water comes off the mountain, melted snow, and provided it's not getting contaminated too significantly between that point and getting to us, we have access to a community well. And so we get that water. In Hawaii, we have great groundwater. Fortunately, there, a lot less pesticides are used. There's still some, and it's sad. And I feel like I've seen cases where folks have gotten injured or diseases resulting from significant pesticide use. For the most part, I'm happy in Hawaii. We have lots of grass-fed and finished, beef and animals that are grazing, and not a lot of pesticides used compared to other places in the world where there's tons of farmland and tons of spraying. We don't really have a lot of that, but I'm still filtering my water, even so. So if you can use reverse osmosis, fantastic. I even add a second step to that, the carbon filtration with the Berkey filter. And there's many other brands out there, but I would consider filtering your water. I really feel like it's really important. The other thing is just the air in your home. There's this old adage that says the solution to pollution is dilution, right? And so just open up the window, number one. And this is something easy to do in Hawaii. We always have our windows open because we have natural air conditioning. We call it the trade winds, and that's what cools us. We don't have regular air conditioning. There's no central air, even though it's blazing hot for 3 or 4 months out of the year. We just open the window, turn on the ceiling fan, and we're having this air circulate. And actually, that's one of the simple steps to increasing the quality of your air at home is just open the windows. And I know it's not always possible because sometimes where folks live, it's too hot in the summer or it's too cold in the winter. Even in the winter, my wife hates this, but I keep our bedroom window kind of cracked. I just like that cool air coming in, but also it's fresh air. And I just have this thing with circulating the air, and I'm like anal in respect to changing those filters. Like once a month, bing, I got this, I think it's called April Air, the HEPA filtration unit that filters the air in the home we stay in Utah with the heat that's on in the winter, because we got to have heat. And so I use the April Air HEPA filtration system, and whatever one you can get that's a good HEPA filtration system for your home, I'd recommend it. I would also recommend opening the windows when you can. And just remember, at the end of the day, you want to figure out not only how to limit your exposure, which I hope I've helped you with a little bit this podcast, but also how to get it out. And many of these substances, it's better to not be exposed because of the significantly long half-lives, whether it be in the 30-year half-life of the heavy metals or the forever chemicals that we talked about. One of my favorite ways to get rid of toxins is to sweat. Like, get a good sweat on. And I'm just kind of a fool for sweating. I love to sweat, and I try to do it every day, no matter where I am in the world. So even if it's winter, I'm doing something to try to sweat. If I can get access to a sauna, I'm going to get in that sauna, or a hot tub, or just going to do vigorous physical activity and wear a bunch of clothes and make myself sweat. Sweating is awesome. You feel great afterwards, and it is one of the best ways to kind of get rid of a bunch of the toxins. So sweating is fantastic. We talked about air. We talked about water, minimizing exposure. We talked about you might need to change your sheets. Maybe get some of this bamboo sheeting that's now available. There's a couple of different companies out there. I don't get kickbacks from any of them. So just take a look. If you have questions, feel free to message me or go on to ewg.org. I love that website. I love the app. I use it all the time. ewg.org. That's the Environmental Working Group. Limit your exposure in the kitchen, right? We talked about getting rid of the Teflon, getting rid of, sadly, a lot of the glazed products like the crock pots. I'm using the Instapot now because the stainless steel is safer. I actually have stainless steel dishes now. The pans, I also have some ceramic pans. I don't use the Teflon anymore. What else can we do? Of course, do our best to reduce pesticide exposure. Grow your own food if you can. I can't easily, and so I'm just buying organic when all possible. Washing, of course. But what I love about the ewg.org website is that they tell you, okay, hey, if you can't afford to buy organic on everything, here's the Clean 15. These are 15 fruits and vegetables that you don't have to be so specific about. And those are things like, for example, pineapple, cabbage, papaya, asparagus, mango, watermelon, sweet potato, honeydew, cantaloupe, that you can potentially buy non-organic and not be having that same heightened level of alertness where you're trying to, buy organic because you're concerned about the pesticides. These are things that, for example, you're just peeling off the skin like a pineapple, right? You're not going to eat the skin of that thing. You're going to cut that crap off. So you don't have to worry as much about pesticides like in avocados, bananas. I mentioned watermelon, mango, papaya, cantaloupe, melon. These are kind of things that you can afford to not do organic. If you're going to buy berries, I always recommend buying organic. I certainly do because they spray the heck out of these things. So if you buy, for example, berries or bell peppers or grapes or cherries or peaches or pears or spinach or celery, tomatoes, bell peppers, chili peppers, apples, strawberries, green leafies like kale and collard greens, try to get these organic because they potentially are heavily sprayed. So you want to do your best. But as I know very well with a family of 8, having 6 kids and 4 teenage boys, that it's expensive to buy 100% organic. So the cool thing about the EWG.org is you can look at that site, and the dirty dozen is the ones you definitely want to buy organic or avoid. And the clean 15 is those that you can afford to not necessarily buy organic and not be worried about significant exposure. And then in your house, I haven't even gotten to this, but try to buy cleaners that are simple. Maybe just vinegar based, vinegar, lemon, the other thing, baking soda. You can make your own cleaners because most of the cleaners out there are toxic. And if any of them say fragrance, like dump that stuff. And in your cosmetics as well. I didn't mention this, but in lipstick, commonly lead, it can get into that. The paint, right? You're painting your lips. Well, there's lead in many lipsticks and mascaras and things like that. So you got to check. You got to be looking at the labels. Use that app, EWG.org. There's a bunch of other great ones out there as well. Even things like nail polish and just all kinds of things that you wouldn't think of. Deodorants, right, that have aluminum. Like, you got to get rid of that crap. There's a lot of great options out there. I don't have time to go over them all, but use the app, EWG.org. Message me if you have questions. I'm still learning. I'm not perfect with this. I'm definitely learning, and I've made a lot of changes to my exposure risk lately, adding, like I was talking about, the HEPA filtration, adding the Berkey filtration for my water, being just more cognizant of whatever cosmetic products, whether it be a shampoo or deodorant, a toothpaste. I'm pretty hardcore on those nowadays. I didn't used to be. Like, I just Colgate, Crest, whatever. And it's like, I don't touch that stuff. I'm getting... not only am I trying to get the stuff with hydroxyapatite, right, that's good for your teeth, but I'm trying to avoid all the other crap that could be in there, right? So got to read the labels, support your body, maybe consider taking a glutathione supplement, make sure you're getting plenty of antioxidants. I have right here in my book, Preventable, a section on things to avoid in food. And I don't have an extensive, exhaustive list. That's literally a whole textbook in and of itself. But I mentioned all of these things that we talked about today, right? Start simple. Use the 5-ingredient rule. Try to maximize your whole foods, single ingredient intake. Make that 90% of your food. And then the other 10%, if you're going to have an ingredients list, make sure you read it. Avoid the big 3 we've talked about, the seed oils, the highly processed sugar, and the highly processed flours. Avoid those. And what's cool is if you avoid those, most of these other chemicals that might be hiding in there that you don't know what they are or whatnot, they usually come together with the highly processed sugars, the highly processed flours, the highly processed seed oils, the industrial oils. So if you just avoid those 3, you actually, by association, will avoid most of these other chemicals that are not awesome. That even though the FDA says they're grass, they're generally regarded as safe, they probably are not. There's also an influencer out there, the Food Babe. You probably heard of her. I think she's phenomenal. She's doing great work. She's alerting us to these things like the yoga mat chemical, if you will, things like that. And I enjoy following her. She's a great follow. If you don't follow her, I'm going to see if I can get her on the podcast. I think she's phenomenal. Lots of just an interesting story and lots of helpful information. Send me questions, comments, concerns. I'd love to hear it. Just message me on Instagram, Dr. Thomas Hemingway. You guys are amazing. It's just why I do this. I love to do this because you guys are the reason. And you make me smile. So please send me a comment. Hit that star farthest to the right, 5-star review. Do it over there on Insta, on Spotify, YouTube. Like, share, subscribe, whatever that is, because that's the reason I keep doing this day in and day out, even when it's snowing like today and 30 degrees in October and it should be 60 or 70. Whatever. I'm smiling. It's amazing. simplify your life, and you can do it really easily, right? The 3 things to avoid: also consider filtering your water, consider the air in your home, the air quality. And one thing I forgot to say is take the shoes off. The tradition we have in Hawaii to take your shoes off has actually been shown to decrease your toxin exposure. Take those silly shoes off. Leave them at the door, barefoot in the house. That's what we do. Doesn't matter where we are in the world. It could be freezing outside. Those shoes are coming off. We are in our homes barefoot and comfortable and enjoying life. Drink a bunch of water, sweat a lot. You got to sweat. It's so helpful to get rid of toxins. And remember these silly forever chemicals and the heavy metals that stick around for 30 or more years. It is a single half-life. You got to avoid them if you can. So any questions, reach out to me, Dr. Thomas Hemingway on Insta, Hemingway, Thomas Hemingway, MD, and alohasurfdoc@gmail.com. Would love to hear from you. Make sure you review the book. Make sure you review the podcast, and you will get a chance to win a copy or 2 of my new book that I will sign it and autograph it just for you. Until next time, aloha. Thanks for watching, and remember to like, subscribe, hit that notification bell so you never miss out. Aloha.